talk about Goth or Gothic, I don't think the pre-medieval Gothic tribes would be the first thing most people think of. And basically, the Goths were Germanic people who originated around the Baltic Sea. Goths were not really a unified nation, but they are different tribes with their own cultures. And even though they are obviously not directly related to the modern Gothic subculture, it's still kinda interesting to learn who these people were and how these Gothic people influenced history. So let's get started. Most historians agree that the Goths came from the Baltic Sea around Sweden or Poland. Germania by Tacitus, a Roman historian, in the year 97 is one of the crucial documents to support the claim that Goths were from the Baltic Sea. Another source that supports its origin is Getica by Jordanes, a Roman bureaucrat who might be a descendant of Goth. However, because Getica contains many mythical and folklore elements, it could be less reliable as a factual document. Not to say that all the information in this document is untrue, by the way. The migration. The first migration of the Goths began around the 2nd century, so they moved from Baltic Sea to the Black Sea or Ukraine. And the cultures that are closely related to the Goths that we can find nowadays are Vilba culture in Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, and another one is Chernyakov culture in Ukraine. After the Goths moved to Black Sea, they were unfortunately forced to migrate again around 376 due to the invasion of another barbaric tribe, the Huns. And here's the result after the invasion. Some tribes moved to the Roman Empire, while others were under the Huns' control. This is when the Goths split into two main groups. Thervingi, the one that moved to the Roman Empire, and Grutangi, the one who were forced to pay tribute to the Huns. If Thervingi and Grutangi don't sound very familiar to you, maybe you have heard of the name Visigoth and Ostrogoth. These two are more popular names for these Gothic tribes. Thervingi is the ancestor of the Visigoth, or it could be translated as the Western Goth, which is not weird because the Visigoths are the group that moved westward into the Roman Empire, and the Grutangi evolved into the Ostrogoth, or it could be roughly translated as the Eastern Goth. Apart from these two, another group worth mentioning is the Crimean Goth. This group remained in the Black Sea despite the Huns invasion and the later Ostrogoth migration. But how does each tribe affect the Western history after this? That's what we are going to explore in the next part. The Visigoths. The Visigoths were settled in Dacia, or modern-day Romania, when they were attacked by the Huns and driven to Roman Empire in 376. Valens, the Roman emperor at that time, saw the migration as an opportunity to acquire new soldiers at a low cost. So he allowed the Visigoths to enter the empire, gave them a settlement in Thrace, which is nice, and allowed them to remain united, which sounds pretty nice. However, moving large number of people caused a food shortage and starvation for the Goths. So Roman officials simply sold off the food before it reached the Goths, leading to their desperation. And the worst part is that they needed to sell one child per one dog for meat, just to have something to eat. This desperation led the Visigoths to rebel, and that was the start of the Gothic War. The war took place around 376 to 382, and I don't want to talk too much about it now, but what's important is that after the end of the war, they declared peace, and the Goths became the Roman Foederati. I'm pretty sure it's not pronounced like this in Latin, but yeah. And they would be called to fill Roman mercenaries. But things were not miraculously peaceful after that. Goths and Romans were trading partners, warring combatants, and whatever allies usually did over a few decades or so, until the age of Visigothic leadership of Alaric I. The Goths started to sack and then succeeded in the sack of Rome in the year 410. I think this is what most people heard of about the Goths. Well, but the thing is that it was not like Goths were the only factor for Rome's downfall. The empire already had its own civil war and economic challenges going on at that time, so the Goths kind of benefited from that. And fun fact, when the peace treaties were still negotiated between the two nations, the Goths demanded free trade, and what they imported from Rome were wine and cooking oil. Okay, so After the sack of Rome, the Visigoths settled in southern Gaul or in France and established their kingdom with Toulouse as their capital. They later spread the influence to the territory of Hispanis, which is obviously modern-day Spain and Portugal. In year 643, Visigothic king Chindasuin issued the law of the Visigoth, which applied to both the Goth and the general inhabitants of the Visigothic kingdom. So as a result, the legal distinction between Goth and some other nationality in the area was blurred and eliminated. They also decreed that everyone who lived in the Visigothic kingdom was considered Hispani. Sounds familiar? After they ruled Hispania in the year 711, the Visigothic kingdom was defeated by Umayyad Caliphate, an Islamic empire, in the Battle of Guadalete in Spain. Next, the Ostrogoth. As mentioned, the Ostrogoths fell under the Hunnic rule, but they did establish their own kingdom later. In the year 451, the Ostrogoths fought alongside the Huns at the Battle of Catalonian Plains, but not so long after that, in 454, the Huns were defeated by the Germanic vassals, including the Ostrogoths. They broke free and lived under their king, Valamir. 1 year after that, in 455, the Ostrogoths moved again, first to Mercia and then to Italy. Under the leadership of Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogoths formed an alliance with the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. The Ostrogoth leader even served as the military commander and was granted the title of Magister Militum, or Master of Soldiers, by the Byzantine Emperor Zeno. However, despite their alliance, Theodoric revolted and attacked Constantinople in the year 486. So Zeno bought a peace that Theodoric could replace the empire's king of Italy, and Theodoric established the Ostrogothic kingdom there. A few years after the death of Theodoric, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian declared war on the Ostrogoths to get control of Italy in 535. The war continued for almost 20 years and caused tremendous damage to Italy, and after the end of the war, the Ostrogoths were exterminated as a nation. Well, at least they made a brief comeback in the battle in the year 552 and 553, but they failed to regain their kingdom. The Goths, who remained in Italy, were after that assimilated by the Lombards, another Germanic tribe who invaded Italy and established Kingdom of the Lombards in 567. Crimean Goth. Well, one could say that the Crimean Goth did not have that much impact on history, when compared to Visigoth and Ostrogoth, but they are the group who maintained their Gothic identity the longest. So, as mentioned, they are the group that stayed around the Crimea or Black Sea even after the Huns invasion. In the 5th century, Theodoric the Great from the Ostrogothic Empire tried to enlist Crimean Goth for his Italy invasion, but only a few joined them. During the 8th to 9th century, the Crimean Goths adopted the Eastern Orthodox Church and then developed close ties with the Byzantine Empire. They maintained their Gothic identity even after the Middle Ages, and they spoke the Crimean Gothic dialect and still live in Crimea and have some documents left until the 18th century. But even though we have more recent documents of this group compared to Visigoths and Ostrogoths, little is still known about the Crimean Goths, because they gradually assimilated with the Greeks, Slav and Tatars over time. In this part, we'll try to see a clearer picture of Gothic social structure, religion, tools and artworks. Social structure. For status, Rex is a term for their military commander or a king. By the 4th century, however, Rex did not really mean a king or a warlord anymore, because this term could be referring to nobles as well. And from the observation of Visigothic cemeteries, the majority of villagers were common peasants who received proper funerals unlike slaves. These peasants were predominantly farmers. They did have a few elites in their community. Let's say that on average, if a village had around 50 to 100 people, there would be at least 4 or 5 elite couples. In general, Goths were skilled potters and blacksmiths. Another fun fact, it is highly likely that the Goths did not assess taxes on their own people. Well, at least that is what the Romans noted. Art. The Cherniakov culture is where we can still find a lot of ancient Gothic artwork. Before the invasion of the Huns, this culture created jewelry, vessels and ornamental items, but their primary production was ceramic wares decorated with incised linear motifs. Another artwork that is very distinctive for the Goth is the polychrome gold work by using wrought cells to encrust gemstones into gold. These gold art pieces are not the Chernyakov culture, but they are more likely those that are influenced by Byzantine Empire or from the Roman art. And here are some examples of their gold art pieces. So the first one is the eagle-shaped fibula and other ornaments from the Ostrogoth. The Visigothic tribe also has a similar eagle-shaped fibula with gemstones encrusted. And this is something I personally find very beautiful. This is the votive crown of Reckensmith from the Visigothic Spain era. Now let's take a look at some of their weapons. Here's a list of objects known to be used by the Gothic tribes in their wars. First category, armor. They have chainmail shirts or lamella cuirass, rounded or oval shields with central boss grip, Spankenhelm-type helmets worn with cheek and neck plates. For their main weapons, they have spears for thrusting and throwing, javelins such as handguns, Celtic-style spada sword, and short wooden bows. To note about their weapons, one feature that is distinctive for the Goths compared to other Germanic tribes is that they don't bury weapons as grave goods, unlike other Germanic funeral rituals. Now this part is quite interesting, which is about the Goth religions. To talk about what belief system the Goths follow, we can divide it into two parts, which are Gothic paganism and then Gothic Christianity. So first, Gothic paganism. Before converting to Christianity, Goths worshipped their own polytheistic gods. They call their gods Anses. They also worship some of their ancestors and nature, like many ancient pagan religions. Their primary trinity consisted of God, Zeus, and Vergungnis. Many people drew an association between Vergungnis and Odin as well. Apart from that, the Romans recorded that Goths also worshipped the god of war. And interestingly, the Romans referred to this god using the name Mars, the same name as the Roman god of war. And while it is unfortunate that there is limited code of other Goth deities, but what's interesting is that there are records of what Gothic tribes think of witchcraft. So the Goths believed that the witches were expelled from the tribe by a king named Philomer, and later the witches mated with evil spirits somehow and gave birth to the Huns, who invaded the Goths and caused them to migrate. And next, the Gothic Christianity. So the Goths were converted to Christianity before the fall of Rome, and the main influence was from a man named Ulfilas, a Greek who was captured by the Visigoths. But despite being captive in the 4th century, he became a missionary bishop for Constantinople, and he translated the Bible into Germanic languages and converted many Goths into Arianism Christianity, the branch of Christianity believing that Jesus was a created being distinct from the Godfather rather than being co-eternal. And apart from Ulfilas, there is a claim that Christianity may have been introduced to the Goths in the mid-1st century through the missionary work of Andrew the Apostle. But we still need to give most of the credit to Ulfilas, who made Christianity more widespread among the Germanic tribes. One significant factor in a culture is the language. What we know for sure for now is that Goths are considered Eastern Germanic peoples, so they spoke languages in the branch of Eastern Germanic. But if you want to know which modern language is directly derived from the Gothic language, it is sad to say that there is none. So unlike the Scandinavian languages that derive from Northern Germanic and English and German that derive from Western Germanic, there is no other branch of Eastern Germanic language aside from Goth. But despair not, we do have some records of the Gothic language left. So the primary source for the ancient Gothic language is Codex Argenteus, which contains a partial translation of the Bible into Gothic that was created by Ulfilas. Although the original version of Ulfilas' work hasn't survived, we can still find some copies in his Bible translation in documents from the 5th and 6th century. So based on his translation, the Gothic alphabet consisted of 27 letters. Roughly 19 or maybe 20 were derived from Greek letters, 5 or 6 modified from Latin, and other 2 could be either runic script or he could invented them himself. And another interesting about Gothic language is their archaic features that had been almost lost by the time that Germanic languages appeared in writing. So some of its features are 1. Passive voice in verbs, 2. Creating past tense by repeating the initial consonants of the verb, and lastly, this is quite common for other languages but not for Germanic, I guess. So it's the use of dual number for referring to exactly two of something in the first and second person of verbs and pronoun, or a specific pronoun to refer to two of us or two of you, for example. And another important sources for deciphering Gothic languages is the Crimean Goth. So you still remember that the Crimean Goth lasted until 18th century, right? Of course, there are documents about Crimean Goth left for us to see what their language structure is like. But nonetheless, since they started to adopt Greek and Tatar languages, the usage of Crimean Gothic has been declining over time. If you're interested, we could still talk about the Gothic language more in the future because I want to mention it here, but I try to make it as brief as possible. And there is a lot more historical detail in the development of the Gothic language. Let's move to appearance. Most Goths had fair or light hair, fair complexions, and blue or light color eyes. Here are some records of their appearance. The 4th century Greek historian Eunapius described Goths as, "Their bodies provoked contempt in all who saw them, for they were far too big and far too heavy for their feet to carry them, and they were pinched in at the waist, just like those insects Aristotle writes of." And Procopius, another Greek historian, theorized that Goths, Vandals, and Gepids might share the same origin because they look very similar to each other. It might sound like he jumped to the conclusion, but that's not a total out of place type of assumption, because all of these three types are considered Germanic by modern scholars. And quite unlike Eunapius' description, Procopius noted that they all have white bodies and fair hair and are tall and handsome to look upon. Well, not quite the image you expect of the barbarians, isn't it? But, well, we can't be sure how good they look anyway, because beauty standards change all the time. So the Gothic architecture style we know nowadays appeared later during the 12th century, like after the Visigoths and Ostrogoths had already vanished, and they were created by the Normans, not the Goths, despite them sharing a similar name. And people during that era didn't even call this architecture style Gothic. This term, however, was coined in the 16th century. A few hundred years later, after the first Gothic architecture cathedral, it was coined by Giorgio Vasari. So in the Renaissance period, most of them admired Greek and Roman art and considered medieval architecture as less refined. So Vasari named the style Gothic after the people who were most responsible for the Rome's downfall and who began the medieval period. But it doesn't mean that there aren't any other places that have a stronger connection to the Goths. So the first one I want to mention is the rock runestone. It's one of the most famous runestones featuring a lost piece of Norse mythology, and it is now beside the church in Östergötland, Sweden. And this runestone is connected to the Goths because it's mentioned the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. Also, in their later years, the Visigoths built a number of churches in Spain, including Santa Maria de Melk and the Church of San Juan de Bayos. And that is how Goths migrated from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and how they were related to the Romans and the Huns, and how they later formed a kingdom in France, Spain, and Italy. And after this, if you still wonder how Goth tribes became Gothic music, fashion, and subculture, I already have another video explaining the whole story, briefly. I hope this video is helpful and enjoyable for you. Thanks for being here. See you on the next journey. Before I started making this video, I just wanted to truly understand the word Goth, but compared to other things like Gothic architecture, Gothic literature, and Gothic subculture, the tribe is something I'm let's say interested in the least. However, after digging deeper into their history, apparently I changed my mind.